She was shaking when they circled her. 12 years of perfect service, and it ended here, in the middle of a hospital lobby, emptying her pockets onto the floor, while patients watched from the waiting room and her coworkers pretended to look away. They called her a thief. They had footage, they said. Inventory records, they said. A signature trail that led directly back to her locker, her badge, her name. Nurse Lena Marsh stood in the center of it all, with her hands open and her jaw tight, and she said exactly 4 words. I didn't take anything. Nobody moved to help her. The termination papers were already printed. If this story has you hooked from the very first second, follow me, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The morning had started the way most mornings started at Harlow General Hospital, badly and ahead of schedule. Lena Marsh arrived at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her shift officially began, because that was how she operated. Not out of ambition, not because anyone noticed. She arrived early because the overnight crew was always running thin by the end of their rotation, and someone had to check the trauma supply cabinet before the day team came in hot. Harlow General sat on the western edge of Caldwell Point, a mid-sized city in coastal Washington that had grown faster than its infrastructure could handle over the past decade. The hospital had expanded twice in 7 years. New wings bolted onto old ones, corridors that connected at strange angles, an emergency department that had been redesigned 3 times and still managed to bottleneck every Friday night. It wasn't a bad hospital. It wasn't a great one either. It was the kind of place that ran on competent people held together by institutional inertia and not quite enough funding. Lena had worked there for 11 years. She'd started as a floor nurse in general med-surg, transferred to the ICU after her second year, spent 4 years there before quietly requesting a move to the trauma bay. Nobody really questioned it. She was good at her job in a way that was difficult to articulate. Not flashy, not the kind of nurse who commanded a room with personality. She just didn't panic. When things went sideways, and in trauma they always went sideways, Lena Marsh had a way of slowing down while everyone else sped up. Her supervisor, a heavy-set charge nurse named Donna Briggs, had once told her she had cold blood, and had meant it as a compliment. Lena had taken it as one. She badged in through the side entrance, nodded to the overnight security guard, and headed straight for the trauma supply room on the east corridor. The cabinet there held the high-value emergency kits, sealed trauma packs, tourniquet sets, advanced airway kits, the kind of inventory that cost real money and required a verified count every shift change. She'd been auditing those supplies informally for the past 6 weeks, ever since she'd noticed small discrepancies in the count sheets. Nothing dramatic. A kit listed as present that wasn't in the cabinet. A replacement order marked complete that hadn't arrived. The kind of thing that got chalked up to paperwork lag. Except paperwork lag didn't explain why the discrepancies kept happening on the same rotation. She was halfway through the cabinet count when the supply room door opened behind her. Marsh. She turned. Dale Sutter, the head of hospital security, was standing in the doorway. He was a tall man with a military bearing that had softened badly into middle age, and he was wearing the specific expression of someone who had been given an unpleasant task and had decided to get it over with. Behind him stood 2 of his officers and a woman Lena didn't recognize. 40s, sharp suit, a lanyard with an administration badge Lena couldn't read from the distance. Put the supplies down, Sutter said. Lena looked at the trauma kit in her hand. I'm doing the shift audit. Put them down and come with us. Something in his tone made her stomach tighten. Not fear exactly, more like the specific sensation of recognizing that something had already been decided without her. She set the kit on the shelf carefully, exactly where she'd found it, and turned to face him fully. What's this about? We'll talk in the lobby. She should have asked more questions. She should have said she wasn't going anywhere until someone explained what was happening. Later, she would replay this moment and understand exactly where she should have drawn the line. Instead, she followed them. The lobby of Harlow General at 6 in the morning was never empty. There were always patients in the waiting area, family members who had been there all night, the front desk staff beginning their handoff, a housekeeping crew running mops across the main corridor. It was the most visible part of the hospital, the place where everyone passed through eventually. That was why they'd chosen it. Chief Administrator Warren Holt was already there when they walked in. He was standing near the reception desk, and with him were two department managers and Dr. Felicia Ruiz from hospital administration, the kind of lineup that didn't assemble itself for routine matters. Holt was in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent 3 decades making institutions work for him instead of the other way around. He'd been at Harlow General for 6 years and had, in that time, streamlined several departments, renegotiated 3 vendor contracts, and developed a reputation for handling personnel problems with what he described as swift resolution. He didn't look at Lena the way you look at a colleague. He looked at her the way you look at a line item you've already decided to cut. "Ms. Marsh," he said, "thank you for coming down." "I didn't have a lot of choice," she said. Holt didn't react to that. He nodded to the security officer on his left, who produced a tablet and turned the screen toward her. The footage was from the corridor camera outside the trauma supply room, time-stamped 3 nights ago, the Wednesday night shift. The resolution wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. A figure in scrubs, badge clipped to the left breast pocket, carrying 2 sealed trauma kits out of the supply room and moving toward the service exit. The badge. The badge read Marsh. Lena stared at the screen for a long moment. "That's not me." "The badge is yours," Holt said. "The access log shows your credentials used at 11:14 p.m. You were not scheduled for that shift." "I know I wasn't. I wasn't there." "The camera. That camera is at the wrong angle to confirm a face." She kept her voice level. She could hear it herself, how controlled she sounded, and she understood in that moment that it would be used against her. A guilty person screams. A guilty person cries. A guilty person does something that lets the people watching feel certain. "I want to see the full footage, not a clip, the full corridor recording for that night." Holt folded his hands. "The investigation is ongoing." "Then why am I standing in the lobby?" Nobody answered that. One of the other managers, a man named Grayson Polk, who oversaw supply chain operations, stepped forward and placed a printed document on the reception desk. It was a termination notice. Lena could read the header from where she stood. "You're being suspended pending investigation," Polk said. "Given the nature of the allegation, we're asking you to surrender your badge and leave the premises." "The nature of the allegation," Lena repeated. "There are approximately $42,000 in missing trauma supplies over the past 3 months, Holt said. "Your access logs show repeated badge activity in restricted inventory areas outside your scheduled shifts. We have footage of what appears to be your badge being used to remove sealed equipment. Until this is resolved—" "You're not resolving anything," Lena said. "You're firing me in the lobby at 6 in the morning before you've finished the investigation. That's not resolution, that's theater." Holt's expression didn't change. "Ms. Marsh, my name is Lena." She hadn't meant to say it. It came out hard and flat, and it landed in the space between them like something dropped. "Not Ms. Marsh, not the employee. I've worked in this hospital for 11 years. I've run trauma response for this department for 4 of those years. I have never—" She stopped, took a breath. "I didn't take anything." The lobby had gone quiet. She could see the faces at the periphery, a family near the waiting area who had stopped pretending to look at their phones. The front desk nurse, who was very carefully not making eye contact. 2 of her own colleagues from the trauma bay who had come in early and were standing near the elevator bank. She recognized the shape of what was happening. She'd seen it before in a different context. The way a crowd settles into silence when something ugly is happening and no one wants to be the person who steps forward. The way people calculate, in real time, whether the cost of speaking up outweighs the comfort of staying quiet. Nobody spoke. Holt reached forward and placed a pen on top of the termination notice. "If you have documentation that contradicts these findings, you're welcome to submit it through HR during the investigation period. In the meantime, we're asking for your cooperation." Lena looked at the pen. She looked at the paper. She thought about 11 years, about the faces she'd worked alongside, the nights she'd stayed 4 hours past the end of her shift because the department was short-staffed, the patients she could still name, the ones she couldn't forget. She reached out and picked up the pen. She was still holding it when the windows rattled. It was subtle at first, a low vibration that moved through the floor more than the air, the kind of tremor that made people look down before they looked up. Then it built, the rotors cutting through the morning air with enough force that the sounds inside the lobby shifted, voices dropping, the ambient noise of the hospital rearranging itself around this new frequency. Helicopters. More than one. Holt looked toward the entrance. So did Polk. So did Dale Sutter, whose hand moved reflexively toward his radio before he stopped himself. Through the glass front of the hospital, 3 black vehicles had turned into the main drive. They weren't ambulances. They weren't police cruisers. They were large, dark, moving with the specific deliberate momentum of a convoy that did not intend to be redirected. The helicopters, 2 of them, settled into a hover above the north parking structure, loud enough now that the overhead fluorescents seemed to flicker in response, though that might have been imagination. Lena stood with the pen in her hand and watched the vehicles stop. The doors opened. The men who stepped out were wearing operational gear, not dress uniforms, not the kind of clothing you put on for a press conference. They were dressed for a working environment, and they moved through the hospital's front entrance the way people move when they are not uncertain about where they are going or what they have the authority to do. The man in front was in his late 40s, dark-haired going gray at the temples, with a jaw that looked like it had been set firmly in place sometime in his 30s and never adjusted. He wore no visible rank insignia on what he was carrying, but he didn't need to. The way the others positioned themselves around him communicated it clearly enough. He walked through the automatic doors without slowing down. He scanned the lobby once, efficient, practiced, and then his gaze landed on Lena Marsh and stopped. She didn't know him. She was certain of that. But the way he looked at her was the way you look at someone you have been specifically looking for. He crossed the lobby in 12 steps and stopped directly in front of her. He looked at the termination paper on the desk. He looked at the pen in her hand. Then he looked at Holt. "Are you the administrator of this facility?" Holt straightened. "I'm Warren Holt, Chief Administrator of Harlow General, and I'm going to need you to identify yourself and explain the nature of—" "Commander James Riley," the man said, "Naval Special Warfare, and I'm going to need you to step back." He said it without raising his voice, without any particular heat. He said it the way you state a fact. Holt blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Step back from this woman," Riley said. "Whatever you think you're doing right now, stop doing it." The lobby had gone completely still. The family near the waiting area wasn't pretending anymore. The front desk nurse had stopped typing. Even the housekeeping crew had paused. Holt recovered quickly. Lena would give him that. He was a man who had built a career on projecting authority in uncertain situations, and he reached for that authority now. "Commander, with respect, this is a private medical facility, and this is an internal personnel matter. Unless you have a court order—" "I have something better," Riley said. He reached inside his jacket and produced a folded document. Not a court order, not a warrant, something else with a seal at the top that Lena couldn't read from her angle. He held it toward Holt without stepping back. "This is a federal logistics agreement between Harlow General Hospital and the United States Navy, executed 14 months ago, covering the handling and periodic inspection of emergency medical supplies maintained under Naval Casualty Response Protocols. The agreement includes specific provisions about who is authorized access to those supplies and how inventory audits are to be conducted." Holt stared at the document. "It also includes," Riley said, "the name of the individual assigned as the authorized civilian liaison for those supply inspections." He didn't say the name out loud. He didn't have to. Every person in the lobby looked at Lena. She exhaled slowly. In her hand, the pen felt suddenly weightless. She set it down on the reception desk without signing anything. Holt's face had changed. The practiced confidence was still there, but underneath it, something had shifted. A micro-expression of recalibration. A man who had walked into a situation expecting one set of variables and had just discovered the board had been rearranged while he wasn't looking. "Our records don't reflect any such agreement," Polk said from behind Holt. His voice was careful, too careful. Riley turned to look at him. It was a short look, not hostile, but the kind of look that made Polk stop talking. "Your records," Riley said, "are what I'm here to discuss." He turned back to Holt. "I'm going to need access to your inventory management system and your surveillance server. My team will be conducting a review of your supply chain records for the past 18 months. We'll also need the original badge access logs, not the summaries, the raw data, and the full unedited footage from every camera covering the restricted supply corridor." Holt opened his mouth. "That's not a request," Riley said. Behind the commander, 2 of his team members had already moved toward the administrative corridor without being told. And in the lobby of Harlow General Hospital, with the sound of helicopters still faintly audible through the glass, and 47 people watching in complete silence, Warren Holt, for the first time in 6 years, did not appear to know what to say. Lena Marsh stood in the middle of all of it, with her badge still clipped to her chest, and her name still printed at the top of a termination notice that no one was looking at anymore. She didn't smile. She didn't say anything. She just waited, the way she'd always known how to wait, steady and still, while the situation around her finally began to shift towards something that looked, for the first time that morning, like the truth. Outside, the helicopters had landed. The rotors were winding down now, that descending mechanical whine that Lena felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. And the sudden relative quiet made the lobby feel even more exposed than it had a moment before. Like a stage after the opening cue, everything locked into position and waiting for whatever came next. Riley had moved to the side of the reception desk and was speaking quietly into a radio. His team, 4 of them, Lena counted, in addition to the 2 who had already moved down the administrative corridor, had spread through the lobby with the practiced, unobtrusive positioning of people trained to control a space without appearing to control it. They weren't touching anything. They weren't blocking anyone. They were simply present, and their presence had rearranged the entire geometry of the room. Holt had recovered enough to gesture Polk and Ruiz into a tight cluster near the elevator bank, and they were whispering. Lena could see the shape of the conversation without hearing the words. The quick, clipped exchange of people trying to determine how much damage had just been done and whether it could still be contained. Dale Sutter had not moved. He was standing 3 feet from where he'd been when Riley walked in, and his expression had gone flat in the way of someone who was doing rapid internal accounting and not liking the numbers. One of Lena's trauma colleagues, a nurse named Priya Okafor, had edged closer during the commotion. She stopped beside Lena and kept her voice very low. "What is happening right now?" "I don't entirely know," Lena said, which was honest. She understood the shape of it. She didn't yet have all the pieces. "That paper," Priya said, nodding at the termination notice still sitting on the reception desk. "Did you sign it?" "No," Priya let out a breath. "Okay, good." Riley finished his radio exchange and walked back toward Lena. Up close, she could see that he was carrying more tension than his posture advertised. The set of his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked the room while he spoke to her directly. "How much do you know about the agreement?" he asked. "I know I was asked to serve as a liaison," Lena said. 14 months ago, I was contacted through official channels and asked to take on an inspection role for emergency supplies maintained under a military medical protocol. I was told the arrangement was confidential, which I understood to mean I wasn't supposed to discuss the details with hospital administration. That's correct. I was also told that the relevant paperwork had been filed with the hospital's administrative office and that the appropriate people had been notified. Riley's jaw tightened slightly. The paperwork was filed. Someone here is claiming they never received it. Someone here, Riley said, is lying. He said it plainly, without emphasis, the way you state a structural fact about a building. This beam is load-bearing, that wall is false. Then he looked past her toward the cluster of administrators still conferring near the elevator. The agreement was transmitted directly to this facility's administrative office 14 months ago, he said. It was countersigned. We have the return confirmation, which means the people in this room who are claiming they had no knowledge of it either failed to read their own correspondence or they're choosing not to remember it. Lena looked at Holt across the lobby. He was still talking to Polk, but he'd glanced over twice now in the last 30 seconds. "The supplies I was inspecting," she said. "The ones in the trauma cabinet." "Federal military medical inventory," Riley said. "Maintained at this facility under a cost-sharing protocol. We supply the equipment. Your hospital provides the physical storage and basic maintenance access. In the event of a mass casualty incident involving military personnel in this region, those supplies are to be immediately available." "They weren't," Lena said. "That's why I started auditing. The counts were off. I thought it was documentation lag at first, but it was too consistent. Equipment listed as present that wasn't there. Orders marked received that I couldn't locate physically in the cabinet." Riley nodded once, slowly. "How long?" she asked. "We've been tracking discrepancies in our logistics reports for approximately 4 months. That's what triggered our review. That's why we're here." He paused. The footage used against you this morning. We were already aware it was compromised before we arrived. Lena stared at him. The timestamp on the clip you were shown doesn't match the metadata on the original file, he said. Someone edited the recording. Not well. They were working fast and they made errors that are obvious when you look at the raw data. My team flagged it 2 days ago when we pulled Harlow General's external camera logs through the federal network. 2 days ago. They'd known 2 days ago, and she had stood in this lobby 40 minutes ago thinking she was going to have to sign her own termination. You couldn't have warned me? She said. Something moved behind Riley's eyes that wasn't quite an apology. We needed to see how far they were willing to take it. She understood that. She didn't entirely like it, but she understood it. They needed the administration to commit fully to the accusation before the evidence was presented, so there was no room to walk it back later as a misunderstanding. There's someone inside administration who's been managing this, she said. It wasn't a question. We believe so, yes. Across the lobby, Holt had stopped talking to Polk. He was looking at his phone now, and his face had done something Lena had not seen on it before. It had gone very still. Riley's radio crackled. He raised it. Go ahead. A voice on the other end said 2 sentences. Riley listened, lowered the radio, and turned to look at the main entrance. We have an incoming casualty, he said. The words hit the lobby like a change in air pressure. Training accident, Riley said, already moving toward the entrance. SEAL team personnel. Medevac is 3 minutes out. Behind them, the emergency department intercom came to life. A trauma activation announcement, the kind that sent the department into a specific organized acceleration. Lena heard it and felt her body respond before her mind fully caught up. That automatic shift in attention that 11 years in trauma will install, whether you want it or not. She was already moving toward the trauma bay corridor when someone grabbed her arm. It was Dale Sutter. You're not authorized to be in the clinical area, he said. You're on suspension. Let go of her, Riley said from 6 feet away without turning around. Sutter's grip loosened. Not because of anything overtly threatening. Riley hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved toward him. It was something else. The specific weight of a statement made by someone who was absolutely certain it would be followed. Sutter let go. Lena moved. The trauma bay at Harlow General was a 7-bed unit that functioned during an active activation, with a specific organized chaos that outsiders often described as frightening and insiders learned to read like a language. There was noise and motion and the smell of antiseptic and adrenaline, and underneath all of it was a structure, a hierarchy of tasks and roles that kept people from colliding with each other and ensured the patient at the center of everything got what they needed. Lena had run this room for 4 years. She knew every cabinet, every protocol, every shortcut and workaround that the department had developed through accumulated experience. She knew which monitor had a sticky lead, which crash cart had been restocked most recently, which ceiling light over Bay 3 flickered under high power draw and needed to be compensated for. She stepped through the doors and immediately assessed the room. The day team was in. 6 nurses, 2 techs, the attending physician on trauma rotation, Dr. Marcus Webb, a competent ER doctor who handled routine trauma well and had a tendency to hesitate on complex penetrating injuries. 2 residents hovered near the supply station. They all looked at her. I heard the activation, she said. Marsh, one of the nurses said, a man named Ellis, who had worked alongside her for 3 years. You're not supposed to be... Medevac is 2 minutes out, she said. What do we know about the patient? Ellis glanced at the doors, then back at her. He made a decision. Male, mid-30s, training accident. Mechanism is blast overpressure with secondary fragmentation injuries. They're reporting tension pneumo and significant hemorrhage control ongoing at the scene. Tension pneumothorax. Air accumulating in the pleural space, compressing the lung, putting pressure on the heart. If it wasn't addressed in the first minutes, the patient's heart would simply stop. Who's the trauma lead? Lena asked. Webb. She found Webb near the central workstation, reviewing the incoming report on the monitor. He was a tall man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he was doing what he usually did in the moments before a major trauma, moving with purpose while looking slightly uncertain about which purpose to move with. Dr. Webb. He looked up, saw her. His expression went through several things quickly. Surprise, then the beginning of an objection. then something that looked uncomfortably like relief. "Marsh, you're—" "I know what I am," she said. "What do you need me to do?" He looked at her for 1 second. "Bay 1, he said, set up for chest decompression and damage control." She was already there. The helicopter came in loud and fast, the rotor wash buffeting the ambulance bay doors, and then the stretcher was through and the medics were calling out vitals in the compressed shorthand of people who had been managing a critical patient in a moving aircraft and needed to transfer that management as fast as possible. The patient was a man who looked like he had been built for difficult situations and had recently encountered one that exceeded expectations. Large frame, early 30s, the kind of physical conditioning that was evident even through trauma dressings, and the gray-white color of significant blood loss. His chest rose in the specific irregular pattern of someone working hard to breathe and not succeeding. The medic at the head of the stretcher hit the bay doors and kept talking. "Blast over pressure approximately 40 minutes ago, training range. GCS was 14 at scene, dropped to 11 en route. Right-sided, decreased breath sounds, tracheal deviation on palpation. We did needle decompression at the scene. Improvement was temporary. Tension pneumo reaccumulated," Lena said, pulling on gloves. "Bay 1, everybody, let's go!" The team moved. There was a moment, it lasted maybe 4 seconds, where the organized chaos wobbled. One of the residents moved into the wrong position and had to be redirected. A monitor lead came loose during the transfer, and the alarm sounded before Ellis caught it. Webb was calling out orders, and one of them contradicted something the incoming medic had just said, and there was a half-second of hesitation in the room while people triangulated. Lena moved through it. "Chest tube setup, right side now," she said to the tech. "Webb, he needs a second decompression before the tube goes in. The needle site from scene has sealed. Someone get me a 14-gauge second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." "I'm the trauma lead," Webb started. "Then lead," she said, not challenging him, informing him. "I'm telling you what I'm seeing. Call it." Webb looked at the patient, looked at the monitor, made the call. "Second decompression, right chest, do it." Lena had the needle in her hand. She found the landmark by touch, second rib, mid-clavicular, the notch that marked the intercostal space, and drove the catheter through. The rush of air was audible. The patient's oxygen saturation, which had been sitting at 81 and dropping, began to climb. The room exhaled. Not literally. Everyone was still moving, still talking, still working. But the specific quality of tension in Bay 1 shifted from acute crisis towards something more manageable, and Lena felt it the way you feel a storm system change, a barometric drop in the room's collective alarm. "Good breath sounds bilateral," Ellis said from the head of the bed. "Sats are climbing. 78, 82, 86. Chest tube," Lena said. "Let's get that in before he reaccumulates again." They worked for another 20 minutes. Webb was better once the immediate crisis had been managed. He had good hands, good judgment on the interventions that didn't require split-second pattern recognition, and he called for the right labs, the right imaging, moved the team through damage control with the methodical competence that was his actual strength. Lena worked beside him, not ahead of him. That was a line she understood. When the patient was stabilized and moving towards CT, the team slowed. The specific decompression of a crisis resolved spread through the bay. People's shoulders dropped a half-inch. Voices returned to normal register. Someone made a comment about coffee that got a tired laugh. Ellis appeared at Lena's shoulder. "Where did that come from?" he said quietly. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. 11 years, she said. He shook his head slightly. "No, that wasn't 11 years in this trauma bay." She didn't answer that. At the door to the trauma bay, she could see Riley standing in the corridor. He hadn't entered. He'd watched from outside through the bay window, the way the military observers sometimes did when they were assessing something. He wasn't looking at the patient now, he was looking at her. And behind him, in the main corridor, Lena could see Warren Holt. He was standing very still, his phone lowered, his face carrying the expression of a man who had built a morning around a certainty and had just watched that certainty dissolve into something he didn't yet have a name for. Two of Riley's team members were standing on either side of him, not touching him, not restraining him, just present. Holt hadn't moved from that spot in the corridor in 11 minutes. Lena counted because she had nothing else to do with her hands while Webb finished signing off on the patient transfer orders and the trauma bay returned to its baseline hum. She stood near the supply station and watched Holt through the bay window and tried to read the situation the way she'd been trained to read a room. Not emotionally, not with the part of her that was still vibrating from the morning's events, but clinically. Inputs and outputs. Cause and effect. Holt was a man in this process of recalculating. She could see it in the stillness, the way he wasn't talking, wasn't gesturing, wasn't performing any of the administrative authority that was usually his default. He was simply standing there with Riley's 2 team members nearby. And the thing that was most telling was that he hadn't called a lawyer yet. She could see his phone in his hand. He hadn't dialed. That meant he still thought this was manageable. He still thought there was a version of this morning that ended with him in control of the narrative. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. Ellis appeared at her left shoulder with a cup of coffee. Black, which was not how she took it, but she accepted it anyway because the gesture meant more than the coffee. Webb wants to debrief on the chest tube technique when things slow down, Ellis said. Tell him I'll find him. He's not the only one. Ellis paused. Half the bay was watching you work on that patient, Marsh. The way you called that decompression, that's not trauma nursing. That's not anything you pick up in 11 years here. She drank the coffee. It was bad. She drank it anyway. I was a medic before I was a nurse, she said. What kind of medic? She looked at him. He was a good nurse, Ellis. Steady, intelligent, the kind of person who asked questions because he genuinely wanted to understand, not because he was building a case. She'd worked alongside him for 3 years and trusted him in the way you trust someone whose instincts you've watched perform under pressure. The kind, she said, that the Navy doesn't put in brochures. Ellis absorbed that. He didn't push further, which confirmed what she'd always suspected about him. He knew when a door was open just enough, and when pressing it would close it entirely. The guy in Bay 1, he said instead. He's going to be okay? If CT comes back clean on the mediastinum, yes. He's got good reserves. He's built for it. Literally, Ellis said. She almost smiled. Her radio, the hospital radio clipped to her hip, which technically should have been surrendered along with her badge that morning, but which nobody had actually asked for, crackled with the charge nurse calling for shift coordination. The mundane machinery of the hospital, still grinding forward regardless of what had happened in the lobby 2 hours ago. She clipped the radio back and turned toward the bay doors. Riley was in the corridor, no longer watching her through the window. He was standing at the nursing station with a woman Lena hadn't seen arrive. Mid-30s, compact, wearing the kind of clothes that were professional without being memorable. She was carrying a case the size of a large laptop bag, and she and Riley were reviewing something on a tablet together. Lena pushed through the doors. "How's he doing?" Riley asked without looking up. "Stabilized. Moving to CT. He lost significant volume, but the surgical bleeding is controlled and his pressure is holding. He's lucky you were here." "He's lucky someone decided to frame me in the same hospital where they were keeping him," she said. "The timing was coincidental." Riley looked up at that. "Not entirely." She waited. "The supplies being maintained here," he said. "They're part of a regional readiness protocol. If there's a mass casualty event involving military personnel in this coastal corridor, this facility is one of 3 designated response points. The supplies here aren't just equipment. They're part of a chain that includes personnel, qualified personnel." He paused. "You're on a response roster, Marsh. You have been for 14 months. "I know." "Then you know that if you'd been successfully terminated this morning, if you'd signed that paper and walked out, your name would have been removed from that roster. It would have taken us weeks to identify and certify a replacement. During that window, the regional response capability would have had a gap," she said. "A documented, deliberate gap," Riley said, "caused by fraudulent evidence submitted against you by someone inside this administration." The woman with the laptop case looked up from the tablet for the first time. Her eyes were the specific shade of gray that looked different in different light, and her expression was the particular blankness of someone who processes information for a living and has learned not to let it show on their face. "Special Agent Dara Villanueva," she said. "Federal Criminal Investigations." "You're not Navy," Lena said. "No. I was asked to join this morning's response based on an ongoing inquiry." She closed the tablet cover. "Ms. Marsh, What can you tell me about Grayson Polk? The name landed differently than it would have 2 hours ago. Polk. Supply chain operations? The man who had placed the termination notice on the reception desk, who had said, given the nature of the allegation with the specific careful phrasing of someone who has practiced a sentence. He oversees purchasing and vendor contracts for the hospital, Lena said. Has for about 3 years. What's your direct experience with him? Limited. He's not clinical. I interacted with him maybe 4 times. Supply discrepancies came through him when I reported them informally through the department head. He told me the documentation lag was normal for the fiscal quarter and that it would resolve itself. When did he tell you that? About 6 weeks ago. Villanueva and Riley exchanged a look that was not subtle enough to be invisible. What? Lena said. 6 weeks ago, Villanueva said, is approximately when our financial forensics team first identified anomalies in Harlow General's federal equipment invoicing. The pieces were not complicated once you had enough of them. Someone inside the hospital had been skimming military medical equipment, not large quantities, not in ways that would trigger an obvious alert, but consistently, over months, in the careful incremental pattern of someone who understood how inventory systems worked and where the gaps in oversight were. The supplies didn't vanish. They were rerouted, marked as damaged or expired, pulled from inventory through legitimate-looking disposal processes and redirected. To where, Lena didn't know yet. What she did know was that she had been getting close to the pattern without understanding it. The discrepancies she'd noticed, the counts that didn't match, the replacement orders that never materialized. She'd been about to escalate formally, and someone had moved first. Polk, she said. We believe Polk was the operational manager, Villanueva said. But we believe the arrangement required authorization at a higher level to access the specific federal contracts and prevent internal audit triggers. Lena looked through the nursing station window toward the lobby corridor, where Holt was still standing. How much higher? She said. Villanueva didn't answer that directly, which was its own kind of answer. The hospital had not stopped running while all of this was happening. That was the thing about hospitals that people who didn't work in them never fully grasped. The institution didn't pause for any single crisis, no matter how significant. Patients were still being admitted. Vitals were still being charted. The cafeteria was still producing a breakfast that smelled of industrial eggs and was still being eaten by people who had been awake all night. Lena was aware of the stares as she moved through the corridor, colleagues who had seen her in the lobby that morning, who had watched the Navy vehicles arrive, who were now performing the specific recalibration of people updating their assessment of a situation in real time. The whispers had a different quality now. Not the whispers of this morning, when she'd been the person being walked out in disgrace. These were the whispers of people who weren't sure what they'd seen and were working through it. She didn't engage any of it. She had work to do. The inventory room on the east corridor, the supply room where she'd been that morning when Sutter came to get her, was now secured. 2 of Riley's team members were inside with a woman who appeared to be doing a physical count, comparing what was on the shelves against a manifest she'd brought with her. The door was propped open, and as Lena passed it, she could hear the low, methodical rhythm of inventory being verified, item by item. She stopped in the doorway. The team member nearest the door, a young man, early 20s, who had the look of someone who had recently finished a lot of training, glanced at her. "Ma'am, how many kits are you finding?" she asked. He looked at his colleague, who looked at the woman with the manifest, who looked at Lena. "We're not at liberty to share findings during an active review," the woman said, not unkindly. "I counted this cabinet 6 weeks ago," Lena said, "and 3 weeks ago, and 10 days ago. I have handwritten notes in my locker that I kept because I knew something was wrong and I didn't have proof yet. Whatever number you're coming up with, I can tell you what it should be." The woman with the manifest looked at her for a moment. She had the patient, evaluating expression of someone who was good at determining whether people were telling the truth. 17 sealed trauma kits are present, she said. The manifest lists 31. 10 days ago, I counted 22, Lena said, which means 5 kits went missing in the last 10 days while I was being set up. The woman wrote something on her tablet. Priya found her near the nursing station on the 2nd floor 20 minutes later. Priya Okafor was one of the few people on the floor Lena considered a genuine friend rather than a work relationship. They'd started in the ICU within 6 months of each other, had transferred to trauma around the same time, had developed the kind of friendship that functioned mostly in the compressed conversations between crises. "Donna wants to see you," Priya said. Donna Briggs, charge nurse, her direct supervisor. "Where is she?" "Her office. Marsh, she's not doing well. She was in the lobby this morning. She didn't—" Priya stopped, tried again. "She didn't say anything when they were doing it. I want you to know that I know that. She didn't speak up, and I think she's—" "I know," Lena said. "She's not a bad person." "I know that too." Donna's office was a small room off the charge nurse station, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs, with a window that looked out over the parking structure. Donna was sitting behind her desk when Lena knocked and entered, and she looked like someone who had been sitting in that chair for a while and had spent the time doing something hard. She was a heavy-set woman in her late 50s, 27 years in nursing, the kind of institutional knowledge that you couldn't replace and most hospitals didn't fully recognize until it was walking out the door. She had a direct quality to her that had never felt unkind to Lena, even when she was being critical. Right now, she looked like she'd aged 5 years since morning. "Sit down," Donna said. Lena sat. "I owe you an apology," Donna said. She said it the way people say difficult things, without preamble, without softening, because she understood that softening it would be a kindness to herself rather than to Lena. "I was in that lobby. I knew what was happening. I didn't say anything." "You didn't know about the Navy agreement," Lena said. "No. But I knew you. 11 years, Lena. I know your work. I know your ethics. And when I watched them put that paper in front of you, I stood there and I didn't say one word." Donna's jaw tightened. That's not forgivable just because things turned out differently than they planned. Lena didn't offer absolution. She didn't think Donna was looking for it, and she didn't think it would help either of them for her to hand it over cheaply. "The supply discrepancies I reported 6 weeks ago," she said instead. Donna nodded. "I passed it up to Polk. He told me it was a documentation issue." "And you believed him?" "I had no reason not to." A pause. "I should have pushed harder. The numbers you gave me were specific enough that I should have pushed harder." "Yes," Lena said. "You should have." Another silence. Not comfortable, but not hostile either. The silence of 2 people sitting with something true. "What happens now?" Donna asked. "I don't entirely know. The federal investigators are working through the records. Riley's team is still here." Lena looked at the window. "Someone in this building has been stealing federal medical equipment for months and framing the person who was getting closest to finding out. That's not a small thing to unravel." Donna was quiet for a moment. "Polk. That's where the investigation seems to be pointing. He's been here 4 years, Donna said. He came in right before the federal contract was signed. Holt brought him in personally from a vendor company." She stopped, seemed to hear what she'd just said. I never thought about those 2 things together before." Lena stood up. She had more to do, and the time she'd spent in this room was time she'd been turning something over in her mind. A specific detail that Villanueva had said, a phrase that had been sitting at the edge of her attention. The arrangement required authorization at a higher level to access the specific federal contracts. Polk had the operational access. But someone had to have given him the clearance to manipulate federal invoicing without triggering automatic audit systems. That required credentials. Specific credentials. The kind that came with the title. She was almost at the door when Donna spoke again. "Lena." She turned. "Your notes," Donna said. "The handwritten inventory counts you mentioned. Get them out of your locker before anyone else thinks to look." It was the most useful thing anyone had said to her all morning. She took the stairs down rather than the elevator because the elevator meant enclosed space and other people, and she needed 30 seconds to think. Her locker was on the basement level in the staff area. A narrow corridor that smelled of industrial detergent and old coffee and the specific institutional staleness of a basement room that never got natural light. She pushed through the door and stopped. Her locker was open. Not broken, there was no visible damage to the lock. Open. The way it would be if someone had used the master key that security kept in the facility's office. She stood in the doorway for one breath, assessing. Then she walked forward and checked the interior. The notes were gone. 6 weeks of handwritten inventory counts, dates and numbers, and the small observations she'd jotted in the margins. Replacement order never received, count sheet doesn't match intake log, third discrepancy this rotation, all of it gone. The notebook she'd kept them in, a cheap blue spiral-bound thing she'd bought from the hospital gift shop, was not in the locker. She stood there looking at the empty shelf where it had been. Then she looked at her phone and opened the Photos app. 10 days ago, after the count that turned up 22 kits instead of 31, she had photographed every page of that notebook before putting it back in her locker. She'd done it almost as an afterthought, the same instinct that had made her keep notes in the first place, a low-level operational reflex that she'd never entirely turned off. 47 photographs. Every page. She closed the app, looked at the empty locker for another second, and then she pulled out her phone and called the only number she had for Villanueva, the one the agent had given her 40 minutes ago in the corridor. It rang once. Villanueva. Someone just accessed my locker and removed my physical inventory notes, Lena said. I have photographs of every page on my phone, but whoever took them did it in the last 2 hours while I was in the trauma bay. A pause on the other end, short and precise. Don't touch anything in that room, Villanueva said, and don't tell anyone else about the photographs yet. Understood. I'm sending someone to you right now. Another pause. Marsh, the person who accessed your locker used a master key. Those are tracked electronically in your facility's system. I know. The log will tell us exactly whose credential was used and when. I know, Lena said again. That's why they're going to try to wipe it before you get there. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 1 second. I need to make a call, Villanueva said, and the line went dead. Lena stood in the basement corridor with her phone in her hand and listened to the building around her. The distant hum of the HVAC system, the muffled sound of footsteps from the floor above, the specific institutional quiet of a space that was never truly silent. Someone was moving fast right now, upstairs, in the administrative wing, in the facilities office, somewhere in this building. Someone had just realized the window was closing and was making decisions under pressure. Decisions made under pressure produced mistakes. She knew that better than most. She also knew that she was standing alone in a basement corridor with photographs of evidence on her phone, and that the person who had sent someone to her locker in the last 2 hours knew exactly where she'd been and how long she'd been occupied with the trauma patient. They had been watching her. The lights in the corridor flickered once, a brief brownout, the kind that happened when something in the building drew a significant power load suddenly. The HVAC hum shifted pitch and then settled. Then the basement door at the far end of the corridor, the one that led to the service tunnels connecting the hospital's 2 wings, opened. Grayson Polk walked through it. He was not moving with the careful administrative composure he'd worn in the lobby that morning. He was moving the way people move when they have made a decision that frightens them and have committed to it anyway. Fast, slightly too rigid in the shoulders, eyes tracking ahead rather than around. He was looking directly at her, and he was not carrying a master key. He was carrying a phone in one hand and something else in the other, something small and rectangular that she couldn't identify from the distance, and he stopped when he saw her clearly, and the two of them stood in that basement corridor 15 feet apart in the particular arrested moment before something irreversible happens. The photographs, he said. His voice was flat, stripped of its earlier professional polish. Give me the phone. Lena didn't move. That was the first thing. The decision not to step back, not to let the instinct toward distance override the tactical read of the situation. Polk was 15 feet away in a corridor with 2 exits, one behind her and one behind him, and he was holding something in his right hand that wasn't a weapon, but wasn't nothing either. A drive. External storage, the rectangular kind, palm-sized. He'd come for the photographs. But he'd also come from the service tunnel, which meant he hadn't used the main stairwell, which meant he hadn't wanted to be seen moving toward the basement, which meant nobody upstairs knew he was here. The photographs, he said again. His voice had the thin quality of someone running on a decision they'd made too fast. I'm not going to hurt you, I just need the phone. You broke into my locker, she said. Give me the phone, and this is over. You walk away, I walk away, and whatever the Navy thinks they found upstairs is already on federal record, she said. Polk, They have your invoicing records. They have the access logs. They pulled the raw camera data before they ever walked into this building. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, exactly. More like a man watching an exit he'd been counting on seal itself. "The phone," he said. "What's on the drive?" He didn't answer. "If you came down here for my notebook and you're carrying external storage," she said, keeping her voice level, keeping everything level, "then the drive is what you pulled from the server upstairs, the surveillance footage, the original files." She watched his face. "You went to the server room before you came here." The way his jaw moved told her she was right. He had the edited footage on there, the original, unedited surveillance files that would show exactly what the camera had and hadn't captured on the night her badge was used. If he destroyed those files and destroyed her notebook and got out of the building before the federal team finished reviewing the electronic logs, there was a version of this where the evidence chain had enough gaps to create problems. Not enough to save himself, but maybe enough to muddy the water around someone else, around Holt. "He sent you," she said. "Nobody sent me." "Holt sent you down here?" "I'm telling you for the last time, Villanueva already knows about the master key log," Lena said. "She called someone the second I told her. That log is either already pulled or it's being pulled right now. Whatever credential was used to open my locker is already on record with the federal team." Polk's hand tightened on the drive. "So if you came down here thinking you could collect the loose ends and walk out," she said, "you're about 4 minutes too late." He moved, not toward her, sideways toward the wall-mounted emergency panel near the service tunnel door. He hit the manual override for the corridor lights, and the basement dropped into the dim amber of emergency backup lighting, the kind that existed to help people navigate toward exits rather than to actually see by. Lena was already moving when the lights cut. She went left, not right, cutting toward the near wall rather than the exit, because the exit was where he expected her to go. She heard him cross the corridor, heard the service tunnel door open, and then she was at the stairwell door and through it, and on her radio in the same motion. "This is Marsh, basement level east stairwell. Polk is in the service tunnel moving toward the north wing. He has an external drive with surveillance files. I need someone on the north tunnel exit now." The radio crackled. Then Riley's voice, clipped and immediate. "Copy. Moving." She took the stairs 2 at a time, not because she was going to catch Polk through the tunnel. The tunnel was longer than the stairs, and she'd come out ahead of him if she moved fast. But because the north wing tunnel exit came up near the loading dock, and the loading dock was the one exit that Riley's team had not visibly positioned near when they'd arrived. They'd covered the front entrance, the emergency bay, the administrative corridor. The loading dock was the operational blind spot. Polk had known that. She hit the ground floor door and pushed through into the north wing corridor, turned left, and was moving at a pace that was faster than walking and slower than running. The specific pace of someone who understood that running in a hospital drew attention, and attention right now was a variable she didn't need. She passed the radiology waiting area, the orthopedic clinic, the small family consultation room that was always either empty or devastatingly occupied, and then she was at the North Corridor junction, and she could see the loading dock access through the window in the fire door at the end of the hall. The door was already moving. Polk came through it from the tunnel exit, slightly breathless. His jacket pushed back on one side where he'd been moving fast through a narrow space. He hadn't expected her to be ahead of him. She could see the specific reset of his face when he processed that she was there. Not panic, but the concentrated expression of someone eliminating options in real time. He had the drive in his hand. "There are federal agents on the other side of that door," she said. "You don't know that." "I know Riley." He looked at the loading dock door, looked at her. His hand closed around the drive, and she could see him thinking. The calculation of whether there was a version of this where he got through the door and into the vehicle bay before anyone stopped him. Polk. She kept her voice flat. Not aggressive, not pleading. "Whatever Holt told you about how this was going to work, it didn't work. It stopped working the moment those vehicles pulled into the main drive this morning. Everything since then has been you making it worse." "You don't know what you're talking about. You've been managing this operation for 4 years," she said. "Holt brought you in from a vendor company specifically because you knew how federal medical procurement systems worked. You knew where the invoice gaps were. You knew how to route equipment out of inventory without triggering automatic audit flags. She watched his face. You were good at it. For 4 years, you were genuinely good at it. And then I started counting the trauma cabinet, and you had 6 weeks to make a decision. His jaw tightened. You chose the wrong one, she said. The loading dock door opened from the outside. Riley came through first, with 2 of his team. Behind them, Villanueva, who had moved faster than Lena had expected. Behind Villanueva, a uniformed federal officer who positioned himself between Polk and the door with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. Polk stood in the corridor with the drive in his hand and 4 people between him and the exit, and Lena behind him, and the calculation he'd been running hit its final number. He held out the drive. Nobody reached for it. They looked at his hand. They waited. I want to talk to someone, he said. His voice had lost its shape. Before anything else, I want to talk to someone. Put it on the floor, Villanueva said quietly. He put it on the floor. The next 40 minutes were not dramatic. That was the thing about the actual mechanics of consequence. They rarely were. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no moment of theatrical reckoning. Polk was placed in federal custody in the North Corridor, and the drive was bagged and documented, and 2 federal officers walked him through the building toward the administrative area while the rest of the hospital continued to function around them. Lena stood at the North Corridor junction and watched them go. She felt something drain out of her that she hadn't entirely known was there. A specific tension she'd been carrying since she'd walked into that lobby at 6 in the morning and seen Holt's lineup waiting for her. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a drop in altitude, the equalization of pressure after a long time at height. Riley appeared at her shoulder. You all right? He asked. Yes. That was a risk, going to the loading dock without knowing where my team was positioned. I knew where you were positioned, she said. You covered the visible exits because that's standard. Loading dock is operational, not public-facing. It's the exit someone uses when they know the building and don't want to be seen. And you knew Polk knew the building. 4 years in supply chain operations, she said. He knew every service corridor and exit protocol in this facility. Of course he knew. Riley looked at her for a moment. You've been doing this longer than 11 years, he said. It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer it as one. Upstairs things were moving. She could feel it in the building's rhythm. The specific change in institutional atmosphere that happens when something significant is occurring at an administrative level. The overhead PA was quieter than usual. The elevator traffic was different. Staff who passed them in the corridor were moving with the slightly heightened awareness of people who had absorbed, through the hospital's informal information network, that something was happening that they didn't fully understand yet. She took the stairs back to the main level and found the situation had changed in her absence. Holt was no longer in the corridor. She learned from Priya, who was stationed near the nursing desk with the alert stillness of someone collecting information for later analysis, that Holt had been escorted to a conference room on the administrative floor 20 minutes ago. Not arrested, escorted, which was a distinction that mattered, at least for now. Ruiz left the building, Priya added. Dr. Ruiz from administration. Her car has gone from the executive lot. I heard it from Tomas in facilities. Lena absorbed that. Ruiz leaving voluntarily while federal investigators were still in the building was the kind of decision that looked like innocence and registered as flight. Where's Donna? She asked. Still in her office. She's been on the phone. Lena found the trauma bay and checked on the status of Bay 1's patient. He'd returned from CT 20 minutes ago. The scan had come back with what Webb was calling remarkably contained damage, which in trauma terms meant the blast had been brutal, but lucky in its specifics. No mediastinal injury. The hemorrhage sites were surgical, not diffuse. He was sedated now, being managed toward the OR for definitive repair of 2 fragmentation wounds in his right shoulder and lateral chest. She stood at the window of Bay 1 and looked at him through the glass. He was large and still and connected to monitors that reported his continuing existence in steady green lines. And she thought about the morning's trajectory, the way this day had started with her being marched toward an exit and had pivoted through a sequence of events that were not random into this room at this moment where someone was alive because she had been in the building to make a specific call in the first 90 seconds. She didn't construct anything meaningful from that. It just was what it was. Webb appeared beside her. Surgical team is prepping, he said. Attending trauma surgeon is Osei. She's good. He'll be fine. I know. Webb was quiet for a moment. He was a man who occasionally needed to work up to something, and Lena had learned to recognize the specific silence. The decompression call this morning, he said finally. You were right, and I was hesitating. I want you to know I know that. You made the call when it mattered, she said, after you told me what you were seeing. That's how a team works. Marsh. He turned to look at her. What are you? I mean, what were you before this? A nurse. Before that. She looked at the patient through the glass, at the monitors, at the green lines that meant he was still here. Someone who did this in places where there wasn't a bay, she said, or monitors, or most of the equipment. Webb absorbed that in silence for a moment. And you left that to become a floor nurse. I see you first, she said. Then here. Why? It was a genuine question, which was the only reason she considered answering it honestly. She thought about how to say it, what was true and what was the version of true that she was willing to put into words in a hospital corridor. Because here, she said finally, I could actually control the variables. Webb looked at her like he was reevaluating a significant portion of his assumptions, which was the appropriate response. Her radio crackled, Villanueva's voice. Marsh, administrative conference room, 3rd floor, now. The conference room on the 3rd floor was the large one, the one used for board presentations and department head meetings, with a long table and a wall of windows that looked out over the parking structure and the city beyond it. The helicopters were visible from here, still parked on the roof of the north structure, their presence a continuing statement of a kind. Riley was there. Villanueva was there. 2 people Lena hadn't seen before, a man and a woman in federal identification, were positioned near the windows with open laptops. On the table were printed documents, a stack of external media and labeled evidence bags, and what appeared to be a full printout of Harlow General's administrative organizational chart with several names highlighted. Holt was not in the room. Lena sat down. We have the server files, Villanueva said without preamble. The drive Polk was carrying contained backup copies of edited surveillance footage alongside the original raw files. He didn't delete the originals. He copied them to take with him, which tells us he was planning to use them as leverage. Against Holt, Lena said. That's our read. Villanueva opened a folder. The original footage from the Wednesday night shift shows your badge being used by an individual who is not you. The person is wearing scrubs with the collar turned up and a surgical cap pulled low. Deliberate concealment from the camera angle. However, the raw file includes metadata that the edited version stripped out. Timestamp embedded in the original file shows it was recorded 17 minutes before the access log entry for your badge. Lena stared at her. Someone cloned my badge access signature. Cloned, spoofed, or used a master credential that mimics a specific badge identifier. Our technical team is still working through the exact method, but yes, the access log entry attributed to you was not generated by your physical badge. Someone with administrative-level system access, Lena said, or someone who had access to administrative-level system credentials, Villanueva said. She let the distinction sit for a second. Polk didn't have that level of system access on his own. His credentials were supply chain and procurement. The kind of access required to spoof a badge identifier in the electronic log sits at a higher administrative tier. Lena looked at the organizational chart on the table. At the highlighted names, Holt was one of them. Villanueva followed her gaze and didn't comment on it directly. We've asked Mr. Holt to remain available for further questioning, she said. He's currently with legal counsel in a room on this floor. He lawyered up fast, Lena said. His counsel arrived on site 18 minutes after we escorted him upstairs, Villanueva said, which means the call was made before we brought him up here, meaning Holt had known this was coming. Not that federal investigators would be in the building. He clearly hadn't been prepared for that, but he'd known that the scheme had enough exposure that he might eventually need a lawyer, and he'd had one on standby. That level of preparation was not the behavior of someone who had been an unwitting participant in Polk's operation. The supplies that were removed, Lena said, where did they go? That's still being traced, Villanueva said. We have financial records showing payments to a private medical supply reseller that operates across 3 states. The reseller is under separate federal investigation for black market distribution of controlled medical equipment. The connection to Harlow General is new. Black market distribution. Federal medical equipment intended for military casualty response, being sold through an unlicensed private distribution network. The scale of what she was looking at had just expanded significantly. Polk was the contact, Riley said from the far end of the table. It was the first thing he'd said since she'd entered the room. He had the vendor relationships from his previous employment. He knew how to move equipment through legitimate-looking channels. Holt provided the institutional cover, the administrative access, the audit suppression, the contract structuring that kept federal oversight at arm's length. And when the federal review started, Lena said, and I started getting close to the inventory discrepancies, you became the most efficient solution to two problems at once, Villanueva said. Remove you, discredit your findings, and create a documented scapegoat in case the federal inquiry went further. Lena sat with that for a moment. The particular weight of understanding that she hadn't been an incidental target, that she'd been specifically chosen because she was the person most likely to find what they needed to hide. There's something else, Villanueva said. She slid a single printed page across the table. Lena looked at it. It was a personnel record, not hers, a name she didn't recognize at the top, a staff classification she hadn't expected. Facilities coordinator, she read. Night rotation. His credential was used to access your locker this morning, Villanueva said. He's 24 years old, been at Harlow General for 8 months, and his personnel file shows a prior work history with 2 companies that are subsidiaries of the same parent group as the private reseller we're investigating. He was already in the building before any of this started. He'd been placed here. How deep does this go? Lena asked. Villanueva looked at Riley. It was a brief look, the kind that communicated something specific between 2 people who had been working a case together long enough to have a shared vocabulary of silences. Deep enough, Riley said, that this building is going to look very different in 72 hours. Lena's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Ellis, a text that read, Bay 1 patient asking for you. He's awake and lucid post-CT, and he's asking for you specifically. She looked at the text, then at Villanueva. I have a patient. Go, Villanueva said. We know where you are. She took the stairs down, her mind still working through what she'd just been told. The network of it, the specific architecture of how something like this was built and maintained, and how badly it had to have rattled someone to look at her, of all people, and decide she was the right person to destroy. She pushed through the trauma bay doors. Bay 1's patient was awake. She could see it from the nursing station. The monitors still green, the sedation protocol adjusted down, and through the bay window the visible signs of consciousness, movement, a hand adjusting the oxygen mask, eyes open and tracking the ceiling. She went in. Up close, he looked worse than he had when he was sedated, which was always the way with significant trauma patients, the body's damage more visible once it wasn't masked by the merciful blankness of unconsciousness. He had the gray-tinged color of major blood loss partially compensated, the oxygen mask fogging faintly with each breath, and a forearm that was more bandage than skin at the moment, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her for a long moment. His voice, when it came, was rough from the airway management and thick at the edges from residual medication. You were in the bay, he said. When they brought me in. Yes. The decompression. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't trying to find words but was deciding whether to use them. Riley told me, he said finally, about what they did to you this morning, what they tried to do. She didn't respond to that. I want you to know something, he said, before they take me up to surgery. He stopped to breathe, the oxygen mask doing its work. Whatever happens in this building today, whatever they decide about your job, your record, any of it, I will personally ensure that Commander Riley has a written account of what you did in that bay, with my name on it. Lena looked at him. At his face, the specific exhausted determination of someone who understood what it meant to be the person in the bed and to have had the right person in the room at the right moment. You don't owe me anything, she said. I know I don't, he said. That's not what this is. She nodded once. It was all she trusted herself to do. She was almost at the bay door when his voice came again, quieter now. How long were you in? She paused, her hand on the doorframe. 8 years, she said. Why'd you get out? She thought about the answer to that question, about the specific truth of it, which was neither simple nor clean, and which she had never put into words to anyone at Harlow General in 11 years. I thought I was done with it, she said. She pushed through the door. The corridor outside was bright and institutional and smelled of hospital, and she was halfway to the nursing station when a radio, Villanueva's channel, broke open with a sound that was not a voice, a sharp interference burst, the kind that comes from a high-power transmission in close proximity. Then Riley's voice, stripped of everything except urgency. Marsh, get back to the administrative floor. Now. Holt's counsel just produced a document, a signed federal authorization that removes all investigative access to this facility's records. It's dated 6 weeks ago. If it's real, the transmission cut. She stood in the corridor with the radio in her hand, and the thing that moved through her was not fear and not anger, but the cold, specific clarity of someone who had been in enough deteriorating situations to know exactly when the ground was shifting under them. If that document was real, everything they'd spent the morning building, every piece of evidence, every chain of custody, every record Villanueva's team had pulled, could be challenged, delayed, suppressed long enough for things to disappear, if it was real. She was moving before the thought finished. The third floor was louder than she'd left it. She heard it before she reached the landing, not shouting, but the specific elevated register of multiple people talking at cross purposes, the sound of a professional disagreement that had stopped being professional. She pushed through the stairwell door and into the administrative corridor and immediately read the room through the conference room's glass wall. Riley was standing at the far end of the table. Villanueva was beside him, and the 2 federal officers who'd been at the laptops were now on their feet. Across the table, a man in a dark suit, Holt's counsel, she assumed, late 50s, the specific groomed confidence of someone who billed at a rate that purchased certainty, had placed a document flat on the table and was speaking with the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Holt was seated to the lawyer's left. His posture had changed. He was sitting straighter than he had been in the lobby corridor, and the particular stillness he was projecting now was not the stillness of a man recalculating. It was the stillness of a man who believed he had just been handed something that changed the calculus entirely. Lena walked in without knocking. Everyone looked at her. The lawyer paused mid-sentence. "Ms. Marsh," Holt said. He said it with a recovered quality to his voice, the administrative composure clicking back into place with the visible effort of a man who had been practicing it for decades. "I think at this point you should probably have your own counsel present." "I don't need counsel," she said. "I need to see the document." The lawyer put his hand flat on the paper in a gesture that managed to be both polite and completely clear. "This is a matter between federal investigators and my client. Your presence here isn't—" "She has standing in this investigation," Villanueva said. Her voice was flat and final. "Leave the document where it is." The lawyer removed his hand. Lena crossed to the table and read it without picking it up. It was a federal administrative authorization, formatted correctly, bearing what appeared to be the right seals and signature blocks, dated 6 weeks ago. The language was specific. It designated Harlow General as a site of protected operational sensitivity in connection with a named federal logistics program, and it restricted investigative access to the facility's administrative records without a separate authorization from a specific federal office that was not naval special warfare. If it was legitimate, Riley's team didn't have jurisdiction to access what they'd spent the morning accessing. Everything they'd pulled, the server files, the invoice records, the badge logs, would be subject to a legal challenge that could take weeks or months to resolve. 6 weeks ago. The same window when Lena had started noticing the inventory discrepancies. The same window when Polk had told Donna that the documentation lag was normal. Someone had spent 6 weeks building a legal exit. "Where did this come from?" she asked. The lawyer straightened his cuffs. "My client secured this authorization through appropriate federal channels in connection with the sensitive nature of the military logistics program operating at this facility. It's entirely legitimate." "It's dated 6 weeks ago," she said, "which means it was obtained around the time your client became aware that a federal financial review was approaching. The timing is coincidental." Nothing about the last 6 weeks is coincidental, she said. Riley had been watching her since she walked in. He hadn't spoken yet, which meant he was waiting for something, either for the legal argument to play out or for someone to identify what he'd already identified. She looked at the document again. Read the specific language of the designated federal office whose authorization would be required to override this restriction. Then she looked at Riley. Is this office real? She asked. Something moved behind his eyes. It exists. Does it have the authority described in this document? A pause. A short one, but visible. That, he said carefully, is being verified. The lawyer heard the pause too. Commander, I'd suggest that verification will confirm. I'd suggest, Riley said without looking at him, that you stop talking for approximately 10 minutes. The lawyer stopped talking. Villanueva had her phone to her ear. She'd moved to the windows, speaking quietly, and the two federal officers at the laptops were typing with the focused speed of people running a search that had a deadline attached to it. Lena stood at the table and looked at Holt. He was watching her with an expression that was almost, not quite, but almost, sympathetic. The expression of a man who had accepted that the morning had not gone the way he'd planned, but who believed he'd found his way to a version of the afternoon that worked in his favor. You're going to want to go home, Miss Marsh, he said quietly. Whatever happens with the investigation, your position here is complicated now. I'd think about next steps. My position here, she said, is trauma nurse, same as it was yesterday. Your position here is a woman who assaulted a member of my administrative staff in a basement corridor. She blinked. I didn't touch Polk. Mr. Polk has a different account of the interaction. She looked at him, at the specific construction of what he'd just done. Not a defense, not an argument about the evidence, but a new offensive line, opened in the last 30 seconds, designed to put her back on the defensive while his lawyer fought the document battle on the other side of the table. He was good. She would give him that. He was genuinely operationally good at this. Polk is in federal custody, she said. He's been detained, he hasn't been charged, and his account of your interaction in the basement is documented. Holt folded his hands on the table. I'm not threatening you. I'm advising you that this situation is more complicated than it appeared an hour ago, and that the people around you may not be in a position to offer the protection you think they can. It was a clean move. Split her from Riley and Villanueva by introducing uncertainty about their actual jurisdiction. Make her feel like the ground under the people supporting her was less solid than it looked. Create enough doubt that she started thinking about her own exposure rather than his. She thought about Donna Briggs telling her to get her notes out of her locker. She thought about Ellis handing her bad coffee because he didn't know what else to do. She thought about the patient in Bay 1 and what he'd said about the written account. Mr. Holt, she said, how long have you been administrator here? He frowned slightly at the shift. 6 years. In 6 years, have you spent a single shift in the trauma bay? That's not relevant to... Have you ever run a trauma activation? Managed a chest decompression, called a damage control sequence on a patient who was 40 seconds from cardiac arrest. She kept her voice even. Do you have any idea what it actually costs to do this job for 11 years? He stared at her. You picked me as your scapegoat because I was quiet, she said. Because I came in early and did my work and didn't make noise. And nobody upstairs really knew what I was or what I could do. You saw a trauma nurse with a badge number and a locker, and you thought she was the kind of person you could point at and walk away from. She looked at him steadily. You were wrong about that from the beginning. Holt's expression had gone very flat. Across the room, Villanueva lowered her phone. Commander, she said. Riley turned. The federal office named in that document, Villanueva said, does exist. However, the specific authorization described, the restriction on investigative access, requires a countersignature from a second officer in that office. Standard dual control protocol for anything that touches active federal logistics programs. She crossed back to the table. The document has one signature. The lawyer's composure cracked, microscopically, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional shift in his weight distribution. But Lena saw it, and she suspected Riley did too. A clerical oversight, the lawyer said. The authorization is still legally unenforceable as presented, Villanueva said. She picked up the document, looked at it once, and set it back down with the specific deliberateness of someone closing a chapter. We're going to continue our review of this facility's administrative records. If your client has concerns about the scope of that review, he's welcome to file through the appropriate federal court, which will take a minimum of 72 hours to process. She looked at Holt directly. We'll be done long before that. The silence in the conference room lasted about 4 seconds. Then Holt looked at his lawyer, and his lawyer looked at the document, and the thing that passed between them was the specific recognition of people who have played their best card and watched it fall short. The next 2 hours were the kind of hours that looked, from the outside, like nothing much happening. What was actually happening was the careful, documented dismantling of 4 years of constructed fraud. Villanueva's team worked through the administrative records with the methodical precision of people who did this regularly and understood that the quality of the documentation mattered as much as what it showed. Every invoice anomaly was cross-referenced against the federal logistics records Riley's team had brought. Every badge access log entry was matched against the raw camera metadata. The drive Polk had been carrying was processed by the technical officer, and the original surveillance files were restored, authenticated, and entered into the federal evidence record. Lena sat in the corridor outside the conference room for part of it, because she'd been asked to remain available and because she had nowhere else to be that didn't feel strange. The hospital was running around her. She could hear it, smell it, feel it in the building's rhythm, and the particular dislocation of being present in a place where her role was suspended, but her awareness wasn't, was something she didn't have a clean way to manage. Priya brought her food at some point, a sandwich from the cafeteria, the kind with the slightly stale bread that was always a sign it had been sitting in the display case since morning. You don't have to stay out here, Priya said. Donna cleared you for the break room at least. I'm fine. You've been awake since before 5. So have you. Priya sat down next to her on the corridor bench, which was the kind of bench that existed in hospital corridors specifically to communicate that sitting was permitted, but comfort was not. What's going to happen? Priya asked. To who? Any of it. All of it. Priya looked at the conference room door. Holt. This place. You. Holt is going to be arrested or he's going to resign before he can be arrested, and either way, he's not going to be sitting in that office next week, Lena said. The hospital is going to have to do a full audit of its administrative structure and its vendor relationships, which is going to be painful and slow. And She stopped, thought about it honestly. I don't know yet. Your job is here, Priya said. Firm, a statement, not a question. My job was here before this morning too, Lena said. That didn't stop them. Priya was quiet for a moment. Ellis is ready to go to the board. So is Webb, apparently, which surprised everyone, including Webb. Donna is writing a formal statement. There are 6 other nurses on the floor who have told Donna they'll sign whatever needs to be signed. Lena looked at her. You've been here 11 years, Priya said. People know what that means, even if they didn't say it this morning. The silence between them was easier than most silences that morning had been. Riley found her in the corridor 40 minutes later. He looked like a man who had been doing something difficult for a long time and had reached the point where the difficult part was almost finished, which was its own specific kind of tired. He sat down on the bench beside her without preamble. Polk is talking, he said. She turned to look at him. He made the decision about an hour ago, Riley said. His attorney advised him that his exposure on the federal equipment charges was significant enough that cooperation was the better calculus. He's been talking to Villanueva's team for the last 40 minutes. What's he saying? Enough. Riley looked at the conference room door. Holt was the architect. Polk was the operator. The arrangement had been running for slightly over 3 years, not 4. The first year Polk was here, he was building the relationships and mapping the system gaps before anything actually moved. He paused. The authorization document his lawyer produced today was fabricated. Polk confirmed it. Holt had it constructed through a contact at a federal contractor who had enough familiarity with the format to make it look legitimate. They were holding it as a last resort. And Ruiz? Lena asked. She left the building. She's been located. She went home. She's cooperating voluntarily. Her involvement was limited to processing some of the paperwork that moved the equipment, and she may not have fully understood what she was processing. He paused. That'll be determined. The facilities coordinator, Lena said. The one placed here. Polk confirmed he was brought in through the reseller network. He had no clinical role. He was here specifically to monitor internal communications and provide physical access when needed. Riley looked at her. He accessed your locker using a copy of the master key he'd made during his first month on site. 8 months. He'd been walking through this building for 8 months with a copied key, and nobody had known. What about the reseller network? She asked. The black market distribution. That's a separate federal case that was already in progress. Today's findings connect this facility directly to it, which expands the scope considerably. He leaned back against the wall. This is going to take months to fully prosecute. But the key question for this facility, for today, is resolved. Holt, she said. Federal agents from a separate office are arriving at this facility within the hour, he said. They're not mine, and they're not Villanueva's. They're from the office that handles fraud against federal medical programs. When they arrive, they'll be executing arrest warrants. Plural. How many? She asked. Holt, Polk, and the facilities coordinator, he said. 3 warrants. Potentially a 4th, pending Ruiz's cooperation interview. Lena sat with that for a moment. The specific weight of 3 arrest warrants materializing in the building she'd worked in for 11 years, the institution she'd arrived at before 6 this morning, thinking she was going to lose. All charges against you are being formally withdrawn, Riley said. Villanueva filed the documentation 20 minutes ago. Your personnel record is being cleared. The termination notice, the one you didn't sign, will be formally voided and expunged. She nodded. She didn't know what to do with her face, so she kept it neutral. There's something else, Riley said. She looked at him. The Navy's Regional Readiness Program, he said. The logistics agreement this hospital operates under. As a result of today's events, the program is being reviewed for expansion. Specifically, the civilian liaison component, the role you've been performing, is being considered for formalization as a full-time position. Formalization, she said, a named role. Funded. With a defined scope that includes both the supply oversight function and emergency medical response coordination at designated facilities in this regional corridor. He looked at her with the specific directness of someone making an official statement rather than a personal one. You'd have to apply. There's a process. I can't offer it to you, and I'm not. What I can tell you is that your name is going to be at the top of a very short list of qualified people when that process opens. She thought about what she'd told the patient in Bay 1. I thought I was done with it. When? She asked. 60 to 90 days. The review has to complete first. She nodded again. Riley stood up. He had the manner of a man who had said what he came to say and was comfortable leaving it there, without requiring her to respond with anything that would make either of them feel better than the morning warranted. One more thing, he said. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded sheet. Not a document this time, handwritten on plain paper. From Bay 1. He asked me to give it to you. She took it, unfolded it. The handwriting was unsteady in the way of someone who had written it with a hand that was not fully their own yet. Large, careful letters, clearly effortful. You didn't hesitate. Neither will I. T. Varga, Petty Officer First Class. She folded it back along its crease. The federal agents arrived at 2:14 in the afternoon, which Lena knew because she was at the nursing station on the main floor when the vehicles pulled into the front drive. Not military vehicles this time, unmarked federal, the kind that were conspicuous precisely because they tried not to be. She watched through the lobby window as 4 agents came through the front entrance. They went directly to the administrative elevator. What happened next moved through the hospital the way significant things always move through hospitals, in fragments, through second-hand accounts, through the specific informal network of a large institution that never officially communicated anything important but somehow ensured that everyone knew within minutes. Holt was walked out through the main lobby at 2:31 p.m. Not the service entrance, not the administrative exit, not any of the routes that would have allowed the moment to pass with discretion. The main lobby. The same floor, the same space where he had lined up his managers and his security staff and placed a termination notice on a reception desk at 6 in the morning. He was in handcuffs. His lawyer was beside him speaking urgently, and Holt was not speaking at all. He was looking straight ahead with the specific blankness of a man who had decided that controlling his expression was the only thing left he could control. Polk came through 20 minutes later, less composed. He'd been in a room with federal investigators for 2 hours, and the cooperative decision that had seemed tactically sound at the time had apparently taken more out of him than he'd anticipated. He walked through the lobby with his eyes on the floor. Lena was not in the lobby when either of them came through. She was in the trauma bay because there had been an incoming MVA and she was needed, and she was a trauma nurse, and that was where she went when she was needed. She learned about the walkout from Ellis afterward, who described it with the contained intensity of someone who had watched something they'd needed to see. The whole lobby stopped, he said. Every single person. Nobody said anything. They just watched. Good, she said, and meant it without satisfaction. Just good. It happened, and it was documented, and the lobby that had been the stage for one kind of moment that morning became the stage for another kind in the afternoon. That was sufficient. She was finishing the MVA documentation at the nursing station when Villanueva appeared. We're wrapping the on-site review, Villanueva said. We'll need you for a formal statement, which can be scheduled in the next few days. Nothing you need to do right now. All right? Your photographs, Villanueva said. The 47 on your phone. We'll need those formally submitted to the evidence record. I know, I'll send them tonight. Villanueva nodded. She started to turn, then stopped. For what it's worth, she said, the way you read the Polk situation in the basement, the locker, the drive, the tunnel exit, the loading dock, that wasn't civilian thinking. I was a civilian who used to do something else, Lena said. What made you come back to it? Villanueva asked. The military liaison role, when they contacted you 14 months ago. Lena thought about that, about the specific phone call, the voice she hadn't recognized, the offer that had taken her 3 days to accept and that she had told no one about. Because the supplies were going to a specific kind of need, she said, and I knew what that need looked like. Villanueva absorbed that without comment and left. The trauma bay quieted around 4 o'clock. The MVA resolved. The patients moved to their respective units, the bay reset, and waiting for whatever came next. Lena sat at the nursing station doing paperwork that was overdue by several hours and that she was apparently still authorized to complete, her badge back on her chest, her name not on any termination document. The charge nurse from the afternoon rotation came to the station, looked at her and said, "You're still here?" "I had a shift," Lena said. "Your shift ended at 3. I had a trauma." "The trauma's been cleared." The charge nurse, a man named Bautista, methodical, not unkind, looked at her with the specific expression of someone navigating a situation the employee handbook had not anticipated. "Marsh, go home. Come back tomorrow. This will all—" He stopped. Reconsidered. "Just go home." She finished the sentence she was writing, saved the documentation, and stood up. She was pulling on her jacket at her locker, her actual locker, which had been formally released back to her after the evidence team finished with the corridor, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Local area code. She answered. "Miss Marsh." A woman's voice, older, measured. "My name is Sylvia Tran. I'm the chair of Harlow General's Board of Directors. I apologize for the hour. I was hoping we could speak." Lena stood in the locker room with her jacket half on and listened. "I've been in communication with federal investigators and with Commander Riley's office throughout the day," Tran said. "I want you to know that the board has been fully briefed on this morning's events and on the investigation's current findings. We are taking this with the gravity it deserves." A pause. "I also want to say, personally, that what was done to you this morning—" "Miss Tran," Lena said, "what is it you actually need from me?" A brief silence on the other end. Then, "I need you to be at the hospital tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. There are some things that need to happen in front of witnesses." Lena finished putting on her jacket. "I'll be there," she said. She ended the call and stood in the locker room for a moment in the quiet. Then she noticed something on the bench beside her locker. A folded piece of paper, placed precisely, not dropped, set there deliberately. She picked it up and opened it. It was a printout of an email thread, 8 messages long. The top message dated that morning at 5:52 a.m., 11 minutes before she'd been called to the lobby. The thread was between Holt and an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, Final Resolution. She read the first line of Holt's 5:52 message, and the locker room seemed to narrow slightly around her. Proceed with the Marsh termination as planned. If she resists, use the secondary file. Secondary file. She read faster. 3 messages down, Holt's contact had responded. Secondary file is ready. It includes documentation of the military liaison role, framed as unauthorized outside employment. Combined with the theft allegation, it terminates her clearance permanently. Not just her job, her clearance, her name on the Navy's response roster, her ability to do the work she'd been doing for 14 months and the work she'd done for 8 years before that. They hadn't just been trying to fire her, they'd been trying to erase her. She stood there with the printout in her hand and the specific cold clarity of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of a thing for the first time. Someone had left this for her to find. Someone who had been in this building today and had access to the email records and had decided without being asked that she should know before tomorrow morning. She looked at the empty locker room, at the door, at the bench where the paper had been placed. She looked at the printout again. At the bottom of the thread, below the last message, someone had written a single line in blue ink, handwritten in the margin of the printed page. There's a third file. They didn't tell Polk about it. D. She stood in the empty locker room and turned the initial over in her mind the way you turn a key, testing it against locks. D. 1 letter, handwritten in blue ink in the margin of a printed email thread that someone had placed on a bench for her to find. Not Donna. Donna didn't have access to Holt's email records, and Donna's handwriting was large and looping, the kind that announced itself. This single letter was small and precise, written with the controlled pressure of someone accustomed to writing quickly and accurately in conditions that didn't always permit either. D. Dara Villanueva. Lena looked at the printout again. At the line above the initial, there's a third file, they didn't tell Polk about it, and felt the specific cold of information that arrives after you think the shape of a thing is settled. Polk had been talking for 2 hours. Polk had given them the structure, the timeline, the names, the reseller connections. But Polk hadn't known everything. Someone had made sure of that, which meant the thing Polk didn't know was designed to survive Polk talking. She pulled out her phone and called Villanueva directly. It rang 4 times, which was 3 more than it had rung any other time today. Marsh. Villanueva's voice was lower than it had been, not quieter, lower, the specific register of someone who had moved to a space where they couldn't be overheard. The note, Lena said. The third file. A pause. You found it. I found it. You left it. I left information that was relevant to your situation, Villanueva said carefully. I couldn't share it through official channels yet because it's part of an active evidence review, but I thought you should know before tomorrow morning. What is the third file? Another pause, longer this time. Lena could hear the specific ambient sound of a parking structure in the background. Villanueva was outside, in her car, or near it, away from the building. When we pulled Holt's administrative records, we found 3 prepared packages, Villanueva said. The first was what you know. The edited footage, the badge access fabrication, the theft allegation. The second was the federal authorization document his lawyer produced today, the one with the missing countersignature. The third, she stopped. The third is a file that was prepared and addressed but never sent. It's a formal complaint to the Naval Special Warfare Oversight Office, alleging that you had been operating your liaison role outside sanctioned parameters, using your access to federal medical supply networks for personal financial gain. The words landed with a specific quality. Not surprising, exactly. She'd already read the email thread, already understood that they'd been building something designed to remove her not just from this hospital, but from everything. But hearing it spoken made it more concrete. They were going to report me to the Navy, she said, if the arrest warrants today had not materialized, if the investigation had stalled on the jurisdiction question, if the fabricated authorization document had held up. Villanueva's voice was level but not uninvested, the tone of someone who is being professionally careful about a situation that they personally find enraging. It was their contingency for the contingency. If everything else failed, they were going to try to destroy your federal standing before you could be used as a primary witness. Would it have worked? It would have created a significant delay, Villanueva said. A formal complaint against a civilian liaison triggers an automatic internal review. Your access would have been suspended pending investigation. It would have taken months to clear, during which time your witness credibility in the federal case would have been complicated. But the file was never sent. No, we believe Holt intended to send it if the situation deteriorated past a certain point today. The arrest warrants moved faster than he expected. A pause. The file has been logged as evidence of premeditated obstruction of a federal witness. It adds a significant charge to what he's already facing. Lena stood in the locker room with the printout in her hand and absorbed all of it. The whole constructed architecture of it. 4 years of theft, 6 weeks of preparation, 3 layered contingency plans, a fabricated federal document, a planted employee, a cloned badge signature, a secondary file, a tertiary file that was never deployed because the morning had moved too fast for the people running the plan to keep up with it. All of it aimed at her, because she had counted a supply cabinet, because she had been paying attention in the exact way they'd assumed a trauma nurse wouldn't. "Is there anything else?" she asked. "Anything I don't know yet?" "Nothing that affects you personally," Villanueva said. "The reseller network investigation is ongoing and will be for some time. But your piece of it, your clearance, your record, your standing, is clean, fully clean. That's confirmed." "Thank you," Lena said, "for the note." "I didn't leave a note," Villanueva said, and ended the call. Lena stood there for another moment. Then she folded the printout and put it in her jacket pocket, turned off her locker room light, and walked out into the parking lot where the evening air was cold and smelled of the coast, salt and concrete, and the faint diesel of the city waking up toward nighttime. She drove home. She slept for 6 hours, which was not enough, and was also more than she'd expected. She was back at the hospital at 7:43 the next morning, which was 17 minutes before Sylvia Tran had asked her to arrive. The lobby looked like the lobby. Same floors, same overhead lighting, same faint institutional smell of antiseptic and recycled air. The reception desk was staffed by a woman Lena had spoken to 1,000 times over 11 years, and who looked up when she came through the doors and said, "Good morning, Lena," with the particular weight of someone who meant more by it than the words. "Morning," Lena said, and kept moving. The lobby filled by 8 o'clock. Not with patients, with staff. She noticed it as she stood near the corridor entrance, the gradual accumulation of people who had no clinical reason to be in the lobby at this hour. Ellis was there, in street clothes because he wasn't on until noon. Priya was there. Donna Briggs was there in her charge nurse badge, and the expression of someone who had decided that the best thing she could do today was show up, visibly and without qualification. Webb was there in his white coat, which meant he was technically on duty and had come anyway. There were nurses from the ICU, from the orthopedic floor, from the pediatric unit, people who had heard something through the informal networks of a large institution and had decided, individually and without coordination, to be present. There were also people she didn't recognize, men and women in civilian clothes with the specific posture and stillness of military personnel who had chosen not to wear their uniforms. 6 of them, positioned in a loose arc near the main entrance. Riley was there. Not in operational gear today. He was in service dress, which was the first time she'd seen him in anything official, and the rank on his shoulder was higher than she'd expected, which explained some things about how the morning before had moved. Sylvia Tran was a small woman in her late 60s, mixed descent, with the particular authority of someone who had navigated institutions for long enough that she no longer needed to perform authority. It simply preceded her into rooms. She came through the administrative elevator at 8:02 and crossed the lobby with 2 board members behind her. She stopped in front of Lena. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You asked me to be here," Lena said. "I did." Tran looked at her directly, not in the evaluating way of Holt's assessments, which had always felt like calculation, but in the way of someone who has seen a specific person and is making sure that person knows they are being seen. "I want to begin by saying something that should have been said in this lobby yesterday morning before any of what happened happened. The fact that it wasn't—" She paused, chose her words. "That failure belongs to this institution, and to the people who were here and said nothing." Tosas itegi. The lobby was quiet. Not the hostile quiet of the morning before, the attentive quiet of people who understood they were present for something that mattered. Lena Marsh has worked in this hospital for 11 years, Tran said, not loudly. She didn't need to be loud. The lobby carried her voice well, and the people in it were listening. In that time, she has worked in intensive care, in trauma response, and in a federal liaison capacity that very few people in this building were aware of, and that she performed without recognition or acknowledgement because that was the nature of the role, and because that is the nature of who she is. Tran turned to address the room rather than just Lena. She was accused yesterday morning of theft in this lobby in front of her colleagues and her patients, based on falsified evidence constructed by people who were afraid of what she was getting close to finding. Someone in the assembled staff shifted, not toward the exit, toward attention. The charges against her have been formally withdrawn, Tran continued. Her record is clear. Her employment is fully reinstated with full back pay for any period of disruption, and it is the board's position that her reinstatement is accompanied by a formal change to her role within this institution. She looked at Lena again. We are creating a new position, funded and permanent, for an emergency medical readiness coordinator, reporting directly to the board with oversight of all federal logistics agreements, trauma supply chain, and emergency preparedness protocols at this facility. We're offering that position to you. Lena stood in the lobby and said nothing for a moment. She was aware of the faces around her. Ellis with his arms crossed and his jaw tight in the way it got when he was feeling something he didn't want to show. Donna with an expression that was composed and shaking slightly at the edges. Webb with his hands in his coat pockets. Priya, who was not bothering to manage her expression at all. I have a condition, Lena said. Tran didn't look surprised. Tell me. The people who didn't speak up yesterday morning, Lena said. She was not looking at Donna specifically, but she was also not looking at her. The colleagues who were in this lobby and saw what was happening and made the calculation to stay quiet. I'm not going to name them. I'm not going to ask you to act against them. But I wanted on the record that what happened here was only possible because an institution had trained people over time to value their own position more than what was right. She paused. The readiness coordinator role has to include a formal ethics reporting structure. Anonymous, protected, accessible to every staff member in this building regardless of their classification or seniority. If someone sees something wrong and wants to report it without losing their livelihood, there needs to be a way to do that. Tran looked at the two board members behind her, a brief, conclusive look. Done, she said. We'll build it into the position charter. The room shifted, not dramatically. There was no applause, no sudden emotional release, because the people in that lobby were medical professionals, and medical professionals are, as a rule, deeply uncomfortable with public sentimentality. But something changed in the air. The quality of the silence became something other than waiting. It became the silence of an account that has been settled. The particular stillness after a thing that needed to happen has happened. Donna Briggs moved through the lobby crowd slowly, making her way toward Lena. When she reached her, she didn't say anything. She stood in front of her and looked at her with the expression of someone who had written 3 drafts of an apology the night before and understood that none of them were adequate and that the only thing left was to be present. Lena looked back at her. Tomorrow, Lena said. 6:30. Come help me audit the trauma cabinet. Donna's expression did something complicated. I'll be there at 6. Lena nodded once. Riley found her near the corridor entrance after the lobby had begun to clear, staff returning to their floors and units, the ordinary business of the hospital reasserting itself with the indifference to ceremony that was its most honest quality. Bay 1 is asking about you, he said. Varga? He's out of surgery. Doing well. Better than expected, apparently. Osei said it was a cleaner repair than the imaging predicted. Riley looked at her. He wants to see you before he's transferred to a military medical facility for recovery. She went to Bay 1. Varga was in a regular bed now, moved from the trauma bay to the step-down unit, the monitors less intensive than they'd been the day before. He was still gray around the edges. Blood loss left a specific pallor that took days to fully resolve. But his eyes were clear and his hand was resting on top of the blanket rather than connected to the number of lines it had required the day before. He looked at her when she came in. You came back, he said. I said I would. No, you didn't. I thought it. Something shifted around his eyes that was close to a smile but was operating through the constraints of a man who had recently had his chest opened. Riley told me about the position, the coordinator role. Word travels fast. Riley talks more than he lets on. He looked at her steadily. You're going to take it. I'm considering it. You're going to take it, he said again. Not pushing. Stating. The specific certainty of someone who has watched a person in a high-stress situation and formed a clear opinion about their nature. You're not someone who walks away from something that needs doing. She looked at him. At the monitors, still steady, at the bandaging on his right shoulder, thick and clean. You should sleep, she said. Probably. He didn't move. I've been in a lot of situations, he said. Bad ones. The kind where you find out who people are. He paused to breathe, the oxygen still doing work. The best ones I've known, the ones you actually want in the room when everything is going wrong, they never look like the movies. They're always the person nobody clocked coming. Lena stood at the foot of his bed and let the words sit. Get some sleep, petty officer, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said, and closed his eyes. She walked out of the step-down unit and through the corridor and past the trauma bay, which was running a routine activation and doing it without her, the way it had always been designed to do, because good systems don't depend on one person, and she had spent 11 years making sure this one didn't depend on her. She took the stairs to the administrative floor, which was quieter than it had been in years. Holt's office was dark. The door closed, a facilities tape across it that had not been there 2 days ago. Polk's office was the same. The corridor felt different without those two presences in it, the way a room feels different when furniture has been removed, larger and slightly uncertain of its own proportions. The office that Tran had indicated would be Lena's was at the end of the corridor, a corner room, smaller than Holt's had been, with a window that looked out over the ambulance bay and the coastal sky beyond it. It had been a storage room for the past 2 years, then a temporary office for a consultant who had stayed 3 weeks. It smelled of old paper and the faint chemical residue of industrial cleaning. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. It was not a dramatic room. It was a small, somewhat unwieldy space with a desk that didn't fit the dimensions well and a window that looked out over a functional rather than scenic view. It was exactly the kind of room that an institution offers when it is doing the right thing without having planned in advance to do the right thing. She decided she liked it. She sat at the desk, not to work, just to sit, and looked at the window. At the ambulance bay below, where 2 paramedics were cleaning out a rig with the systematic detachment of people who do necessary work and understand that the necessity is the point. At the coastal sky, which was gray and textured with the specific kind of clouds that didn't necessarily mean rain, but were keeping the option open. She thought about the last 36 hours, about the sequence of it, the supply cabinet, the counts that didn't add up, the decision to keep notes, the notes in the locker, the photograph of every page. She thought about the fact that nothing she had done was remarkable. She had paid attention. She had written things down. She had not signed a document she didn't believe. She had answered a phone call from a man in Bay 1's bed who needed an airway managed and had managed it. That was the whole of it. None of it was special. All of it was necessary, and she had been the person willing to do it without an audience or an acknowledgement or any particular expectation that it would lead anywhere worth going. The thing about being underestimated, and she had thought about this in the abstract and the specific, in more context than this one, is that the people doing the underestimating are rarely doing it with malice. They are doing it with the comfortable efficiency of people who have sorted the world into categories that work for them and have no interest in being corrected. They see a trauma nurse. They see a woman who arrives early and leaves on time and doesn't cause problems and doesn't call attention to herself. They see someone whose competence lives in a room that administrators don't visit. They see what they are looking for. They see nothing else. The error is not in being underestimated. The error would be in accepting the estimation. She had never accepted it. Not once. Not in 8 years of doing a job in places this desk would never be able to comprehend, and not in 11 years of doing a different version of the same job in this building. She had simply been what she was, in the rooms where she was, and had waited with the specific patience of someone who understood that the truth of a thing and the recognition of that truth do not always arrive together, but that if you keep doing the work, They tend to eventually occupy the same space. Yesterday they had. Her phone buzzed. Ellis. A text. Trauma Bay is asking if you're on call. I told them you were busy becoming a department head. Was that wrong? She typed back. Tell them I'll be down in 10 minutes. She stood up from the desk. She looked at the room once more. At the wrong-sized desk, the functional window, the smell of old paper, and made a decision about it that was not complicated. She took the stairs down. The trauma bay was mid-activation when she came through the doors. A level 2 response that had the team moving at the specific calibrated pace of trained professionals who were not panicking and did not need saving. Ellis caught her eye from across the bay and lifted his chin toward Bay 3, where a tech was struggling with a monitor lead and a resident was hovering with the particular uncertainty of someone who knows the right thing to do and keeps second-guessing the timing. Lena crossed the room. Move, she said, not unkindly. I've got it. The resident moved. She found the lead, made the connection, watched the monitor come live with the information it was supposed to provide. The resident looked at the reading and made the right call immediately, the way residents do when they finally have the data they've been waiting for. Good, she said, and she stayed where she was needed, doing the work that had always been hers, in the room that had always been hers, while outside this building the legal and institutional machinery of consequence ground forward, warrants processed, charges documented, a reseller network mapped and dismantled link by link, a facilities coordinator who had walked these corridors for 8 months with a copied key, facing federal charges that would take a court 2 weeks to read aloud. Warren Holt was formally charged 48 hours later. 4 counts of federal fraud, 2 counts of evidence tampering, 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, and 1 count of filing a false complaint against a federal civilian liaison. His attorney entered a not guilty plea that no one in the building believed would survive contact with the evidence record. Holt pleaded guilty to 3 federal charges in exchange for cooperation, and the cooperation was substantial enough to implicate 3 additional individuals in the reseller network who had not previously been identified. The facilities coordinator, whose name was Marcus Weil, and who was 24 years old and had made a decision at 23 that he was going to spend a long time being sorry for, was charged and remanded. Dr. Ruiz was not charged. Her cooperation interview had established what the evidence also supported, that her involvement had been administrative processing without full knowledge of the scheme's nature. She resigned from Harlow General 2 weeks after the investigation concluded, and whether that was conscience or expedience or both was a thing she would have to live with, and that was not Lena's to judge. Donna Briggs was at the trauma cabinet at 6 a.m. the morning after the lobby ceremony. She and Lena counted every item in silence and reconciled every line of the manifest, and when they were done, Donna said, 26 of 31, and Lena said, the replacement order goes in today. And Donna said, I'll send it myself. After that, they went and got coffee. It was still bad because it was hospital coffee, but they drank it and they talked for 40 minutes about the department and the ethics reporting structure and how to make the trauma bay a place where a person with something to say had somewhere to say it. It was not a reconciliation exactly. It was something more workable than that. 2 people who understood where they had been and where they were and what they were going to do about the distance between those 2 points. Tanya Varga, Petty Officer First Class, who turned out to go by Tanya rather than T, and who was the kind of person who corrected you about it while still recovering from chest surgery, was transferred to a military medical facility on day 4 and sent Lena a message 3 weeks later from a rehabilitation facility in a state she didn't specify. The message said, full shoulder function projected. Also, Riley says you took the job. Good, she had taken the job. The formal start date for the Emergency Medical Readiness Coordinator position was a Monday 3 weeks after the board's announcement, but she had effectively been doing the work since the Tuesday following, because the Federal Logistics Agreement review was ongoing and the supply chain needed oversight, and there was no one else in the building who understood both ends of the work. Tran had noticed this and had said nothing about it officially, which Lena had taken as institutional permission. Her first formal act in the position was to submit a comprehensive inventory audit to the Navy's Regional Logistics Office, a full accounting of what had been present, what had been removed, what had been recovered, and what needed to be replaced. Riley reviewed it and replied with 2 words, thorough, good. Her second act was to establish the anonymous ethics reporting system. which was designed in consultation with two nurses, one ER tech, and a custodial staff member who had, it turned out, noticed something wrong 2 years ago and had no idea where to take it. Setting that up took 3 weeks and 3 meetings, and one significant argument with a board member who thought the legal liability implications needed further review, and she won the argument because she had learned, in a very direct way, what happens to institutions that don't have places where the truth can go. On the morning of her second week in the position, she arrived at the hospital at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes early. Same as always. She went to the trauma supply cabinet on the East Corridor first, not because it was required, not because anyone was watching, but because it was where this had started and because paying attention to the thing in front of you, even when no one else is paying attention to you, is the entire practice. The counts matched. The replacement order from the previous week had arrived. The cabinet was full. She stood in the supply room and looked at it for a moment. She thought about the kind of woman you have to be invisible in a system that benefits from your invisibility. How you learn to carry what you know quietly, without waiting for permission to know it. How you develop a patience that looks, from the outside, like passivity, and is actually the specific discipline of someone who understands that the right moment is not the same as every moment. She thought about the patient in Bay 1 who had said you never stopped serving, which was true in the way that the most honest things are true. Without ceremony, without decoration, just as a fact that sits cleanly in the available light. She hadn't stopped. Through 8 years and 11 years and one morning in a lobby that had tried its absolute best to be the end of something, she hadn't stopped. That was not heroism. That was not a story worth telling because of its drama or its reversals or even its justice. Though the justice was real and it mattered. It was worth something because of what it said about the decision, made quietly and repeatedly and in the absence of any audience, to keep being exactly what you are. Some people get to walk back through the same door they were pushed out of. Most people don't. But the work? The real work. The work that exists in the supply cabinet, and the trauma bay, and the ethics form that sits on a server with an anonymous intake field. That work doesn't need a door. It needs someone willing to show up for it before anyone is watching and still be there when they finally are. She closed the cabinet. She went to work.